things on the side with vulnerable children and orphans.
Okay, cool. So you've done other mission trips before in your life, right?
Yes.
So how many other mission trips have you been on?
I think, I'm like trying to remember, but I think I've been on total, like in the U.S. and outside the U.S., I think I've been on around 15 mission trips.
Okay, and when did you like first start doing mission trips?
I first started doing mission trips when I was, I think, in middle school. So it was around 7th, 8th, I think it was 8th grade. 8th grade year is when I started doing it.
So has missions always just kind of been like your life calling, or did you kind of realize this later in life?
I realized it actually later in life.
Yeah.
It's a long story on how God has led me. But let's see. I wanted to be a veterinarian growing up.
Yeah.
And ever since I was probably 8 or 9.
Okay.
And obviously that didn't happen.
Yeah.
But anyways, I was in high school. Or no, I went on my first trip in middle school.
Uh-huh.
Then in high school I went to, I've grown up at Southeast Christian Church. And in high school I went to Bible and Beach, which is the what's it called? It's like a camp basically for high schoolers. And
I think that is Bible and Beach.
Bible and Beach, yes.
Yeah.
So I went to Bible and Beach it's just during my sophomore. I went every year I think, but during my sophomore year, so my second year of high school. And the last night there, I remember specifically at the end of the sermon that the pastor asked, like, if anybody wants to go, feels like they're called into ministry, please stand up. And I remember sitting in my seat, and as I sat there, I started shaking and crying. I didn't understand what was going on, and I just felt somebody, like, pull me up out of my seat, and I knew, like, that was God. And I stood up, and at that time, I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what it meant to go into ministry, what it meant to be a missionary or a pastor or anything. Anyway, so that like tugged on my heart for a while, and I started talking to my parents. But I also remember backtracking to when I was 9 years old, I remember I was in the kitchen one day, and I told my mom, I remember I was doing something, and I turned around to my mom, and I told her, one day I'm going to be in Africa. And I think that was the time of saying, like, God was saying, like, yes, one day, like, your daughter is going to be there. And but anyways, fast forward, I went to college at Asbury University.
Yeah.
And I was actually studying missions firsthand, and then halfway through college, I decided to switch to youth ministry. So I actually, once I graduated college back in, it was like December 2014, I have a degree in youth ministry in like a minor in missions.
Okay.
So anyways, after I graduated, it's a long story, but after I graduated, I'm trying to think of that. So I met one of my mentors today, called Dr. Florence Mwindi, who's the head of Life in Abundance.
Okay.
And she told me, she's like, Kirsten, God wants you to come to Africa for an internship with Life in Abundance this summer. Why don't you think about that? And I was like, okay. So I prayed about it and thought about it, and then I applied to do the internship, and I was gone, I think it was 10 weeks.
Yeah.
So I was 2 weeks in Kenya, and then the rest of the weeks in Ethiopia, and it was awesome. I learned more about missions and how to be a missionary.
Yeah.
And then I came back, and people started asking me, well, Kirsten, what are you going to do? And I was like, well, I'm going to start applying for jobs as like a youth pastor, see if I get anything. And all the jobs, I wasn't getting called back.
Yeah.
And so I just decided, okay, well, I'll just full-time nanny as I was doing when I got back, and just help out with the youth at church.
Yeah.
So that's what I did. And then I went to the Passion Conference in January 2016.
Yeah.
And the second night there, God audibly spoke to me. Like, I had never been so desperate to hear God's voice and to know where God wanted me to be.
Yeah.
And God's voice, I audibly heard his voice. He told me, Kirsten, you're to go live in Kenya, and you're to work with children and youth. And that's all he said. He didn't tell me time, day, year, when I would go. So I came home and told my parents, and my mentor and I just prayed over it and prayed about it. Yeah.
How did your parents receive that? Because, I mean, like for me, like I always hear that, you know, it's a beautiful thing when somebody wants to go do missions and stuff like that, but it's also like, you know, as parents, like, it's hard to let their child go to the other side of the world, you know. So did they handle
question.
it well, I guess?
I think they did. Yes,
Yeah.
as parents, I try to put myself in their shoes a lot, but I think it would be hard to send your daughter or your son like overseas.
Yeah.
I remember telling my parents at the dinner table, and at the table we were eating dinner, and I just started crying, and now I'm getting emotional, but my so my parents they responded well. They just told me, you know what, like, if this is what God wants you to do, we want you to pray about it. How about you ask your mentor more about where God's calling you and see what the next steps are to Kenya. So I messaged my mentor about it, and she responded back to me within like the next day and told me, why don't you come to Kenya on your own? We can show you around for about 10 days to different ministries and see like what opens up. So I think the first time I ever, like, besides being with like a mission trip team, I flew to Kenya April 2016, and I think that's when I saw God move. Like, that's when I saw the doors open. And to really see how you're asking, like, how my parents responded, I think they responded really well. Like, really well, and very supportive. They've always been very supportive.
Okay, cool. Cool. So when you went over there for the 10 days, you obviously met a lot of people, but where was the point, I guess, where you realized that this vision was going to come true?
That's a good question. Okay. So I remember, I think